In this video, we're going to utilize the color channel from ExplosiaFX inside a Cycles 4D material in order to create this colorful explosions render. We'll use the point density texture node to bring in the color of our ExplosiaFX solve, and then we'll apply that color to our smoke and fire. We'll tweak that color using hue saturation value nodes, and then finally create a masking system with the color channel. Okay, so here we are in Cinema, and of course we're looking at the color channel from ExplosiaFX and how to render that in Cycles 4D. So of course we need a demonstration scene to be able to extract a color channel from, and I've currently got the ExplosiaFX object turned off, and if we hit play we'll be able to see that we have some particles, they're bursting in the air much like fireworks, except the difference here is that we have an ExplosiaFX tag on this bursts emitter, and if I turn our ExplosiaFX on, go back and play again, you'll see that we have these explosions at the end of our particles. And those particles, they are color coded. You can see that they're red, green, and blue. And we're coloring them actually using groups. So if we go to that emitter, the shell emitter, and we go to groups, you'll see that we have a red, green, and blue group. They're identical apart from just the color. This was just a nice way to create a sequential separation of the color. So each particle is emitted, and then it'll cycle through red, green, blue, and then repeat red, green, and blue, and so on. Now, what's happening then is that we are getting to a certain point, and in fact, it's a question. So if we go to the questions tab, so when they reach a certain age, we can go down here, you'll see we've got this particle age burst with a sub-question of random probability. So basically, once it's over a certain age, which is 30 frames, which is a second, of course, in this scene, and then a random probability suggests that after that 30 frames, you'll have a chance for it to explode and spawn more particles. And those spawned particles are called our bursts. So the burst ones are the smaller particles coming off the main one, and they are the ones that we are using to drive our ExplosiaFX. Now, they are also inheriting the color from the shell. And then that color, if we go to our ExplosiaFX tag, you'll see is set to 100%, then go to the ExplosiaFX object itself. And if I go to the solver tab, you'll see that color has been activated, and we're not seeing it at the moment because we haven't got it displaying. So display tab, and then we'll change that to color. And there we go. We can see that this is now the color channel in our ExplosiaFX object. It's storing our red, green, and blue particles, but also, of course, red, green, and blue data in each of the voxels that it needs to. So that's the rundown of the scene. Let's take a look at how we can use that color channel in a material, in a Cycles 4D volume material. So we'll start with a basic material. We'll go to Cycles 4D and then in volume, principled volume. Now this is quite a new node, it's very useful. It essentially allows us to combine all the parts of a volume that we need, so scattering, absorption, and emission all together in one node, and it just makes it nice and easily controlled. And whilst it's selected, let's rename our material to EFX Colorful Explosions, and let's assign that to our ExplosiaFX object at the top here. Now next we need to actually read the data from our ExplosiaFX object into our material so that it can interpret it correctly, and we can assign which channels we want to actually drive which parts of our principled volume node here. And we do that using something called a point density texture node. Now if you need to find a node in Cycles 4D, you can of course find it in the node list, and I've actually got mine hidden. So you go to options, node list, and then you can either start typing point density like so, which is nice and quick, or we can go down here and browse, and you'll see we've got the point density texture there. I like to actually keep this bit of node editor real estate free, so I actually have it collapsed, and I just use the tab. So I'll bring up tab, and you'll see we get the same list, but it's actually floating where the cursor is, and we just drag in our point density texture node like so. Okay, so the default one is set to XP particle position, and that's for a different method. That's actually to have particles drive the point density here, but we want the density to be created or to be read in from our ExplosiaFX object. So we need to change our drop down here from particle position to ExplosiaFX, and we're going to read in, to start with, we're just going to read in the burn channel. So that's also the fuel channel in ExplosiaFX. I'm going to disable these two. We don't need those on right now. And I'm actually going to change the interpolation down here to cubic. And what that means is it'll smoothly interpolate our simulation. So we'll get nice smoothly interpolated voxels. So now our point density texture node is bringing in that data. It's bringing in the burn density. We can actually use that density to drive our emission strength. So basically, wherever there's any burn or fuel density in our ExplosiaFX volume, we're actually going to get that multiplying into our emission strength. So essentially, wherever we want it to be hot and burning and fiery, it's going to be generating an emissive ray in the Cycles 4D. However, there is going to be something weird. If I hit play now on our real-time preview, I hit play on our timeline so that we get some volume generating, you'll see something very odd. And as you can see, press pause again, you'll see that we get this huge homogeneous volume of scattering and absorption. And what it is it's our adaptive bounds, and they're being filled with an exact density of 1. As you can see, we've got this multiplier because it's a simple multiplier at the moment. We're not bringing in any of the EFX data to this particular part, this density, which is the scattering and absorption. So for now, we need to actually deactivate this, and we can just multiply that to 0. So no data, no density is being added to the voxels in the Cycles 4D render. And there you go, we get the resulting emissive burning channel there. And just to prove that, let's change the color. So let's change it to a yellow, like so. And there we go. We can see that's our burn channel. If I go to our display on our ExplosiaFX object, let's view our smoke and our fuel. And you can see we're seeing the fuel in here is obviously a lot hotter, and it's been set up in a slightly different way. Currently, we're just bringing in the fuel channel as it is from the ExplosiaFX object. There's no mapping happening to it. There's no different opacity, so it looks quite soft. So what we're going to do is we're going to sharpen that up with a ramp. So I'm going to bring this over here. I'm going to add a ramp, color ramp like so. Now, if I drag this in between, Cycles 4D automatically lets things connect. However, if it's you can see here we've got this factor input here, the gray one, and it's going to another factor input, which is another gray one. If I drag that in between, Cycles 4D tries to connect up the relevant ports, and it actually ends up connecting our alpha. So you see we actually get another homogeneous volume. Really what we want is we want to connect up this color here. So we want to make sure. So that if that ever catches you out, we can do that. And there we go, and I've connected it up, and it looks almost no different to before. What we want to do is we actually want to edit that gradient. So first of all, I'm going to bring this one in, and this essentially will clip the outer parts of our fluid, the softer parts of our fluid, so we get a bit of a sharper look. Let's bring this up here as well, like so. And there we go. So this is around about 15-20% in here, and this is about 80% down here. And if you look at the display on the fuel opacity on the ExplosiaFX object display tab, you'll see that it actually has a third knot, and this knot is actually to create a sort of a hollow effect where perhaps the fuel would be still unburnt and therefore not at the right temperature. So that gives that nice sort of hollowed out fiery look. And what we'll do is we'll do the same on our color ramp here, like so. And I'm just going to drop that brightness down to almost 0, and you'll see it actually culled out the center of our fluid there. So we'll get a bit more sort of detail to our simulation. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we actually want to bring the brightness level up. And currently it's obviously at the default, which is 0 to 1. And we want to multiply it to give it a much more bright resulting value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a math node, like so. I'm going to change this function to multiply. And you'll see we got another homogeneous volume there. That's because I was just adding and before I changed it to multiply. So currently it's 0.5, so it's half the amount of density. But if I increase it, let's say dramatically increase it to 100, you'll see that we get an extremely hot looking simulation there, a hot looking volume. And also I've currently got a bloom set on our camera, so I can actually turn that off if it's overpowering. You'll see I've got the bloom activated, and you'll see there, we can see our yellow color is being bleached out to this nice hot white color. So wherever we've got the most density, it's looking the hottest. And the color here, if I just change it to anything, let's change it to a more natural fiery looking color. If I have it at full saturation, it'll actually remain at a colorful value. We won't be able to saturate it or bleach it out to a white. So you need to have at least a little bit of desaturation, like so, and it'll be enough to just give us that white core. So that's looking really nice. Obviously the colors are going to be driven from elsewhere. It's a bit over hot at the moment, so I'm going to drop that back down. Let's drop it to 30. And there we go. That's a good basis for our coloring here. Now, what I like to do on all of when I'm bringing in point density, so I'm bringing in one of the channels, is I actually like to drop in a hue saturation node as well. So I'm going to drop in a hue saturation. Oh, it's an HSV node. So hue saturation like so. Now I don't want to connect it up to the multiplier here. I just want to have it sat in line so that it is ready to work. And I'm just going to have it feed our emission color. Now the reason I'm doing this is that I like to be able to change the colors on the fly. And if we've got some colors coming into this, I can then change these using the hue and saturation sliders. So I'm going to leave that at the default there like so. I'm going to set this to let's do it at 50% gray, just so that we know that when there. So that means that when we don't have any color input, these will look white like so, and I'll know something might be wrong with the import. Okay, so let's put that up in line like so. And we can bring all this whole section here down over here. If we zoom out, you can see we've got our point density texture is bringing in the data. We're then ramping that. We're multiplying it, so we're increasing its density. And then we've actually got this hue saturation ready to set the color of that emission channel. Now, this is the part where we bring in our color from our simulation. Now, let's go to our ExplosiaFX object, go to our display and change it to color. And as you can see, we've got the nice green, red, and then we'll have a blue coming in a bit later on as well. In fact, we can let that play on a little bit further. And there we go, the blue's coming in now as well. And you can see at the moment, all of the volume that we're seeing in the preview is all the same color, it's all white. Now, of course, as I mentioned, we are going to bring in the color, and we just need another point density texture node to do that. You can see here, we have a color output on the burn. Now I'm going to copy and paste that. I'm actually going to control drag that up here. And this is going to be for our color. So I'm going to change the EFX burn to ExplosiaFX. And at the bottom here, you'll see color, EFX color. So nothing's changed, of course, because I haven't connected anything up. However, if I then drag this color output from our EFX color into our hue saturation value node, we'll immediately see that our emission is now being driven by the color from our simulation. So this is as simple as that is. We have taken the color information, the RGB channels, and A channels from our ExplosiaFX simulation, and we're now piping that into our HSV over here, which is for our burn or our flames here. And now we can actually tweak the values. So I could drop the saturation down. Like I said, you want it to be below 100%, and it'll bleach out to the white value like so. And as you can see, that looks really nice. I might go back up to the 0.9, just bring a bit more color in like so. Okay, so now we've actually got our color being fed into our material here. We can actually use it to drive the color of our smoke as well. So we need to set up our smoke. So first of all, let's put this into a frame. If we hold Alt F, you'll see that we get a frame. And if I hit enter, we can call this flames. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to duplicate this. So I'm going to go grab this whole frame and I'm going to drag it up to the top here. And we're going to rename this one. So hit enter. We're going to call this one our smoke. There we go. So we've got exactly the same kind of nodes, except we're going to tweak, obviously, the individual settings to suit our smoke. So in here, we're going to change our burn. We want to bring in our smoke, of course. So EFX smoke. And then we're going to change this particular gradient. We don't want it to be hollowing out the center of our smoke anymore. There we go. And I actually have these sort of predefined, tested these out beforehand. So I've got some values that I like to go to. And I'm going to set this up to a bit more dense, but we'll connect it up first and then we'll tweak some settings. So of course, we've got our principled volume. We now want to drive the density using our smoke channel. So let's go back to our ExplosiaFX object, just so we know which one we're talking about. Let's go to our smoke channel and you can see there's our smoke. If I let the simulation play on a touch as well, just to get a bit more smoke added to our scene. There we go, let it play on. There we go. So you can see our burn channel is actually fading away. It's dissipating, and we're going to be replacing it with smoke. So let's drag this multiplier connection down to our density of our whole principled volume node. And we should start to see a really nice looking smoke. There we go. Now, of course, our color here is set to the gray, the default gray value. We want to set this up so that it is a color. So, of course, we have our hue saturation up here. And I want to connect up our color just as we did down here on our flames. I want the color from our ExplosiaFX solver to come and drive the hue saturation in our smoke. Now, of course, there are two colors involved in our smoke, and that is our scattering and our absorption color. So let's actually drag these and connect them up first, and then we'll deal with what we're gonna see. So immediately you'll see that we have our color being scattered and absorbed, and you're getting this kind of this nice colored smoke. Now we can tweak obviously this particular setting. In fact, let's increase the density. Let's increase it 100-fold. So it's really dense, and you can see it's getting quite dark as well. So it's absorbing a lot of the light. It's still scattering a lot, but it's also absorbing as much, and we're actually losing quite a lot of the color. And what we can do is we can actually separate out we can have a separate hue saturation value node. So if I copy that one, just drop it down here, make sure it's still connected up to the color, and I can drop that into the absorption. And what I can do is I can play with the amount of saturation here, drop that down like so, and it'll just brighten up our volume. We can even sort of increase the brightness of this color that's coming out here, and you'll see we get an overall brighter looking smoke. Obviously the saturation value, if I drop it all the way down to 0, it's still going to be colored by the scattering, but you'll see that the core actually becomes quite desaturated. So where most of the light is being absorbed, we're getting the bright value here. And if I go to a value of 0, essentially we're getting a black, and you get this very interesting but much darker looking smoke. So if we go to 0.5, go to 2 again, it'll bring that up nicely. A bit over bright, but the saturation's down, so put it to 0.5, bring the color back in, and there we go, we have our smoke. Now, something to note about color and scattering in general, we need to go into our render settings for this. Now, each of our bounces inside our volume will actually increase the brightness of that volume. So currently I've got it set to 1, which is actually not the default. If I reset that to default, set it to 0, it will render faster, but we'll actually get a much darker looking volume. So we need to increase that, and you'll see if we let it resolve for long enough, we're going to get a much brighter volume. So if you're finding that your volume is not getting brighter despite changing or tweaking the settings, you may need to come into the render settings and tweak a few things here. Now, whilst we're here, I'm going to actually drop that back down to 1 because I'm quite happy with the brightness there. And if we look at our volume step size, our heterogeneous volume step size, that's actually the slicing from the camera of our volume. So if I drop the step size down to 5, we'll get a slower render again, but we'll actually bring in more detail. And what happens is if we go really low, we'll actually get a lot more absorption. So you might need to increase the volume steps to compensate for that. And you might want to desaturate your colors, you might want to make them brighter, that kind of thing to compensate. So I'm going to leave it at the default of 10, that's fine for me. But just something to note that when you're dealing with color and scattering volumes, those settings are key. Okay, so we've got our setup here. Now this one up here is for our scattering. So I'm going to actually rename this, hit enter. I'm just going to call it HSV scatter. And then this one is our absorption, so HSV absorption, like so, and there we go. So now this is all very procedural. We can actually completely change the color of our whole simulation if we change the input color. Now, of course, we can do that a few different ways. We can actually solve a totally different color, and our simulation here is utilizing the color of the particles. In fact, it's the color of the groups in the particles. You can see here, we have all of our group particles. However, if I actually override those, I've got a color modifier here deactivated, and I have this gradient set. So essentially, it's a gradient by parameter, And if I actually turn our ExplosiaFX off completely, just so we can see just the particles, and I activate our color modifier, hit play, and you'll see we're getting different colors on our particles, and they're being inherited and they're changing over their age. So this gradient is over age. And if I reactivate our ExplosiaFX object, hit play, and we'll see something very interesting going on. And there we go. You can see our particles are now the driver for the color of our simulation, of our fluid. And this is really powerful, of course, because you can control the color, the parameters of our particles, and then they can drive our simulation. Now, of course, you might want to be tweaking these colors. I mean, you can see here the smoke here looks quite muddy, perhaps. So you might want to increase the brightness on, or increase the value on the scattering here, just to increase it, make it a bit brighter like so. But you can see the potential here is for some really interesting looking simulations. And using the color channel from EFX, I'm going to put that back to where it was. And I'm going to turn off our color like so. Go back to our original red, green, and blue. And of course, so we've got the color imported. We can also now change it using a hue saturation change. And we could do that independently. So we could do that on each of these. So we could do one on each. So we could change the hue on the scattering only. It gives sort of interesting looking effects, different kinds of smoke. But if we wanted to do it all at once, we're going to need to do that as soon as the outputs come out of the color here, of the color point density texture. So what we'll do is we'll actually add another HSV. So another HSV node. And this time we're going to actually intercept these particular outputs here. So I've now got an HSV going into the emission. I've now got it going into the absorption, and I've now got it going into the scatter. Now nothing's going to change, of course, because this HSV is all set to default values. But if I start tweaking this and I start pushing it around a bit, you can see that we can change the color of our simulation. We can change the look of our simulation after it's been solved. So this is, we don't have to calculate our solver again. We don't have to cache anymore or do anything like that. We can actually do this at render time. So this is really powerful. So let's change this to 0.75 just to get a slightly different look. There's quite a sort of a 80s retro look there. And if I hit play, of course, we could do the same to the particles. Currently, they're using their default values. And there we go. So all with a few sort of nodes in between, the hue saturation nodes, we can change the color of our simulation completely. Now, there's one last thing. I'm going to actually default that back to 0.5, like so. And we'll go back to our nice red, green, and blue. Okay, so the one last thing I want to look at is actually using the color channel as a utility, actually using it as an ID. And I've actually got a material already set up to work for this. And what we'll do is we'll drag that and we'll replace it with replace the one that we've created with that one. And you'll see it's a more traditional explosion material. It looks like a hot, fiery explosion with some dark smoke. And what we're going to do is I'm going to demonstrate that we can actually use our color channel as a mask. So if I select that material, you'll see it's in groups. It's been, not groups, sorry, it's in frames. And if I zoom down here to our emission, which is the fiery part, of course, I have this multiplier that comes out of our EFX burn channel. That actually then is being colored by the temperature and black body stuff. And you can see we've got all of these separated out channels. So we've got our scattering, our absorption all separated. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to multiply in one of the color channels to actually only have that be the emissive fiery channel. Now that might sound a bit weird, so let's just do it by demonstrating. So I'm just going to grab our burn here. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to drag it into here. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have this multiply. So add a math node and I'm going to have it multiply. And I'm going to connect this up. So now we've got a math node that is multiplying by this density. So at the moment, obviously, we're bringing in the burn. And I want to change it from that to our color channel. Now, if I do this, it's not actually going to be able to do anything because multiplying the color, it's going to do some strange things. You see that gets a little bit darker and this one stays quite bright, but it's a bit confusing. So what we need to do is we actually need to extract our color. And what I mean by that is I'm going to use something called a separate RGB. So Let's bring up the separate RGB. Drop that in like so, in between there. And it's currently set to the red channel only, and immediately you'll see we're multiplying by the red channel. And what that means is that only where there is red channel information, and if we go to our ExplosiaFX object and display those channels, so wherever there's red, you can see that's where we're going to get our emission. So we've actually created a sort of quite an advanced masking system, so that now if I connect up the green, only this one will have the multiplication of that color. So we get the green. And of course, the last one there is the blue. Oops, shouldn't connect it up to there. Connect it up to the blue, like so. And we'll just get it on the right-hand side here. So this is just a demonstration that the color channel isn't just useful for coloring your simulation and coloring your particles. It's also very useful for creating utility masks and AOVs. So let's put our colorful shader back on one more time, and let's let it solve a little bit further along. And there we have it. We've created a material that can interpret the ExplosiaFX color channel. We can then use that data to color our fire and our smoke, and also the ability to tweak that color using the hue saturation value node. And of course, this is all kept very procedural. It's based off the particle color in this instance. So if we change the color of the particles, our simulation will change along with it.